I need to tell you who I used to be because for a long time I didn't know myself. My name is Nora. I'm 34 years old. I work as a pediatric nurse at a regional hospital in central Indiana, and until about 2 years ago, I thought I had a pretty clear picture of my life, even if it wasn't a pretty one. I knew where I came from. I knew where I came from. I knew why I felt out of place. I had explanations for everything. Turns out explanations aren't the same as truth. I was raised by my stepfather, I'll call him Dale, and my mother, who died when I was 9. After she passed, it was just the two of us. Dale wasn't cruel the way people imagine when they hear stories like mine. He didn't lock me in closets or forget to feed me. He just never once looked at me like I belonged to him, not at dinner, not at my school plays, not on the day I graduated high school and stood there in a cheap polyester robe waiting for someone to take my picture. He was physically present for most of my childhood and emotionally somewhere else entirely. When I was about 12, I asked him directly why he never called me his daughter. Not even on forms, not even casually. He always said my wife's kid or just the girl. Never my daughter, never my name if he could avoid it. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Because you're not." That was it. No explanation, no softening, just that. I told myself for years that he meant it technically. He'd adopted me, but we both knew it, and he was just being honest. My mother had been pregnant when they married. He knew I wasn't his biologically. Fine. Some step-parents just never fully bond. I read enough pop psychology to build a whole framework around his detachment that let me function. I was good at functioning. Nursing school, clinical rotations, first job in Indianapolis, then a transfer to the hospital in Carver County where I've been for the past 6 years. I was good at my job. I still am. There's something about taking care of other people's children that I found, I don't know, stabilizing, I guess. Like I could give kids something I never quite had. I had a small apartment, a rescue cat named Button, a best friend, Lee, who brought me soup when I was sick and told me when my haircuts were bad. A life that looked fine from the outside and mostly felt fine from the inside too, as long as I didn't push on certain spots. The spot I didn't push on was this. I had no idea where I came from. My mother had never talked about my biological father. When I asked as a child, she would get this look on her face. Not sad exactly, more like she was choosing her words from a very small pile. And she'd say, "He wasn't able to be in our lives, baby." That was all. He wasn't able to be in our lives, baby. Like it was a logistical problem. Like he'd had a scheduling conflict. After she died, there was no one left to ask. Dale didn't know or claim not to. Her parents had both passed before I was born. There were no aunts, no cousins who stayed in touch. I was, as far as I could tell, genetically floating. I'd thought about doing a DNA test before, the kind you order online and spit into a tube and mail back. But something always stopped me. I think I was afraid of finding out something ugly. That my father had a criminal record, or a whole other family, or that there was some reason my mother had been so careful never to say his name. I finally did it in November of the year I turned 34, and it wasn't because I was feeling brave. It was because of a little boy named Theo. Theo was 6 years old and had been on our pediatric ward for 11 days with a condition that required a bone marrow transplant. His parents had been tested. Extended family had been tested. The match registry had been searched. Nothing close enough. His oncologist asked our department if any staff members would be willing to volunteer for registry testing, not necessarily for Theo specifically, but to expand the general pool. Several of us signed up. I signed up. They took a cheek swab. I thought nothing of it. I went back to my shift. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the registry coordinator. I stepped into the break room because I thought it was going to be a 2-minute conversation about paperwork. It was not a 2-minute conversation. She said my sample had flagged an alert in the system. Not a transplant match, something else. She was careful with her words, the way people are when they're trained to be careful. She said my DNA profile had been cross-referenced with a national database, and there was a potential match to a file I might want to be aware of. I asked what kind of file. She paused, and then she said, a missing persons case. From 1991. I remember the way the fluorescent light buzzed above the break room refrigerator. I remember a coffee cup someone had left with Rachiel written on it in black marker. I remember my own heartbeat, which suddenly felt very loud and very slow. I said, I'm sorry, what? She gave me a name, not mine, a name I'd never heard. She said there was a detective at the Indiana State Police who had been listed as a contact on this case and that she was required to notify them. She asked if that was okay. I couldn't speak for a moment. Then I said yes. I stood in that break room for a long time after the call ended. The rest of my shift was, I don't know how I finished it. I was on autopilot, checking vitals, updating charts, smiling at a 4-year-old who wanted to show me her stuffed elephant. My hands were steady. My voice was steady. Inside, I was completely untethered. When I got home that night, I sat on my kitchen floor with Button on my lap, and I Googled the name the coordinator had given me, Nadia Voss, infant female, taken from Methodist Hospital in Fort Wayne, Indiana on March 3, 1991. 2 days old. Parents, Arthur and Lorraine Voss of Fort Wayne. There were old news articles. The kind with grainy, scanned photographs, a woman with dark eyes and cheekbones like architectural features, holding a baby in what looked like a hospital room. A man standing next to her with his hand on her shoulder. Both of them photographed later at a press conference. The woman barely holding herself together in a way that made my chest ache to see even as a stranger. The baby had been taken between a routine blood draw and the next nursing check. Security footage from 1991 wasn't what it is now. A woman in scrubs had walked out of the maternity ward carrying a duffel bag. That was all they had. There were follow-up articles. The case had gone cold within a few years. The parents had never stopped looking. Lorraine Voss had given interviews as recently as 2019. She had gray in her hair by then, but the same cheekbones. She said she still had her daughter's handprint. They'd done one at the hospital, some kind of keepsake program. She said she kept it in her bedroom. She said she'd know her daughter if she ever found her. I was on that floor for a very long time. I want to be honest about what the next few days were like, because it wasn't a clean, triumphant feeling. It was disorienting in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent 34 years building a self out of particular materials. The narrative of who I was, where I'd been, why things were the way they were. Even the painful parts of that narrative were load-bearing. Take them out, and things get structurally uncertain. A detective named Harlan called me 2 days after the registry coordinator. He was older, I could tell from his voice. He'd been the secondary detective on the case years ago and had stayed loosely involved. He was precise and very kind, and he told me that the profile match was strong enough that he'd like to arrange a formal DNA confirmation if I was willing. I said I was willing. He told me a little more about the case. The baby had been taken by a woman who was never identified. The Voss family had searched for decades. Lorraine Voss was still alive. Arthur had passed in 2017. There was an older brother, Lorraine's son from a previous relationship, technically my half-brother, who had also been involved in the search. Then, Harlan said something that stopped my thinking completely. He said Dale's name. I asked him to repeat it. He did. He said they had reason to believe Dale had known where I was, for years. I'll try to explain this part carefully because I've had time to process it now and I still find it hard to describe. Dale had worked as an insurance adjuster in the 90s. He'd handled a life insurance policy for a woman named Renee, my mother, the woman who raised me, and that's how they'd met. Renee had been a distant relative of the woman who took me from the hospital. Not close. Second cousin, something like that. When the woman who took me died in a car accident in 1996, she left me, a 5-year-old, with Renee. Renee apparently didn't fully understand the situation at first, but Dale did, or figured it out. There were financial records, a trust that Arthur Voss had set up for his missing daughter, administered through a legal contact, that Dale had accessed through fraudulent documentation. Not a huge sum, a few $1,000s over the years, drawn down in ways that were designed not to trigger alerts. He'd known who I was, and he'd let it stay buried because the alternative meant explaining himself. I want to be clear that my mother, Renee, the woman who raised me, I don't believe she fully understood. I think she knew there was something off about my origins and was afraid to ask. I think she loved me the best she could with the information she had. I think about her differently now than I did before, with more grief and more tenderness at the same time. But Dale? I drove to his house. I know that's not what you're supposed to do. Harlan had specifically said to let the investigation proceed, but I drove to the house I'd grown up in, which he still lived in, and I knocked on his door at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. He opened the door. He hadn't aged particularly well. I looked at him and I said, "I know." Just that. He tried for a moment to do the thing he'd always done. The slight blankness, the way he'd always looked at me like I was a minor inconvenience that had wandered into his sightline. But something in my face stopped him. I've thought about this moment a lot. I think in that moment he knew it was over. He didn't say anything. He stepped back from the door and sat down heavily in the entry hall, on the little bench where we used to sit to put on our shoes. I didn't go in. I just stood there. I said, "You knew the whole time." He didn't deny it. I said, "My mother searched for 34 years. She's still alive. Her husband died never knowing." He looked at the floor. I said, "I hope you understand what that is." And then I left. Harlan called me that afternoon. Apparently Dale had called a lawyer by 10 that morning. That was fine. Let him call a lawyer. The evidence was what it was. The formal DNA test came back 6 days later. The match was confirmed. My name, my original name, is Nadia Voss. I've been Nora for 34 years. I'm not changing it now, but I know what I was called first. Lorraine Voss lives in a house outside Fort Wayne with flower boxes on all the windows, which I know because I drove past it twice before I found the courage to stop. Harlan had facilitated an initial phone call, and she had been so careful on that call, so careful not to overwhelm me, that I'd cried for an hour afterward in a parking lot. I knocked on her door on a Friday afternoon in early February. It was cold. The flower boxes were empty for winter. She opened the door. She had the same cheekbones as the photographs. Her hair was silver now, and her eyes were dark. And when she looked at me, she made a sound I don't have a word for. Not a word. More like something that had been held in for a very long time, finally being let out. She said, "You have your father's hands." That was the first thing she said. Not my name. Not a question. Just that. I had to sit down on her porch steps because my legs stopped working correctly. She sat down next to me. We sat there in the February cold for a while before either of us went inside. My half-brother is named Felix. He's 41, a high school history teacher, and he has the same slightly ironic delivery my biological mother has. And when he met me for the first time, he shook my hand very formally and then immediately started crying, which I found so unexpectedly disarming that I started crying too, which he said later was highly efficient of me. There's a handprint in a frame on Lorraine's bedroom wall. She showed it to me. A tiny pink ink handprint from a 2-day-old infant, 34 years old, slightly faded. She held my hand up next to it. My adult hand, obviously much larger. But she looked at the shape of the thumb, the slight arch of the palm, and she nodded very quietly to herself, like she was confirming something she'd already known. I visit her on Sundays, when my schedule allows. We are still learning how to be in each other's lives. There's no template for this, no script. Some visits are easy and some are strange, and once we sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes, not saying much of anything, just drinking tea, and it was somehow exactly right. Dale was charged in March. Fraud, obstruction, accessory after the fact. His lawyer is doing what lawyers do. I've given my statement. I've said what I know. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I've decided, is separate from what I'm building now. I think about my mother, Renee, a lot. I think she was a woman who made a choice she didn't fully understand the weight of and then loved me as fully as she knew how. I'm not at peace with all of it yet. I don't think I have to be yet. What I am is clear. for the first time. I know where my hands come from. I know whose cheekbones I have. I know the name that was given to me before anything happened to change it. Button is still on my couch. Lee still tells me when my haircuts are bad. I still work nights sometimes and walk through the pediatric ward at 2 in the morning when it's quiet and the only sounds are monitors and small breathing. I'm still Nora. But now I know that Nora had a beginning, and the beginning had a name, and the name was said with love on the day I was born by two people who spent the rest of their lives trying to find me. That's enough. Actually, it's more than enough. It's everything. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in a mystical way. I don't have a framework for that, and I'm not sure I want one, just in the plain observable way. Actions accumulate. Choices have weight. What Dale did wasn't one dramatic decision, it was 1,000 small ones, made over decades, each one quietly compounding the last. He chose silence the first time, and that made the second time easier. And by the time I was 12 and asking him why he never called me his daughter, the lie had been running so long it had its own momentum. He'd built a life on top of it. That doesn't make it understandable. It makes it sadder, actually, because at some point early on, there was probably a version of events where he told the truth and everything was different. He didn't take that door. And every day after that, the door got smaller. I think about my mother, Renee, differently than I used to. I used to think of her absence as just loss, clean and simple. Now I think of her as someone who was also caught in something she didn't fully choose, who loved me as genuinely as she knew how with the pieces she had. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Intelligence isn't just about knowing facts. It's about being honest enough to look at complicated things without needing them to be simple. Renee was not a villain. She was a person who made a choice she didn't fully understand, and I have to hold both of those things at once, the harm and the love, without collapsing one into the other. What I keep coming back to is Lorraine. 34 years. She kept a handprint in a frame on her bedroom wall. She gave interviews in 2019 with gray in her hair, still saying her daughter's name out loud to whoever would listen. That is not passive hoping. That is a decision made over and over every single day to keep going without any guarantee that going would lead anywhere. Most people would have quietly stopped. She didn't. And I think about what that kind of persistence requires, not certainty, because she didn't have certainty, but something more durable than certainty. A refusal to let the absence win. I want to be that kind of person. Not specifically about this, I have my answer now, but in the general sense. Persistent past the point where persistence feels reasonable. Honest even when honesty is structurally inconvenient. Willing to sit on cold porch steps in February and not rush the thing that needs to unfold slowly. Felix shook my hand very formally when we met and then immediately started crying, and I have thought about that moment probably more than any other moment in this whole story. Because he'd been searching too, in his own way, for a sister he'd never met, and when I finally stood in front of him, his whole formal composure just gave out. That's what happens when you carry something long enough and then you can finally put it down. The relief is bigger than you expected. I'm still Nora. I work my shifts, I feed my cat, I let Lee tell me when my haircuts are bad, but I know now that the self I built, even built imperfectly, even built on top of something that was broken, held, I'm still here, and now I know where here came from. That's what I want to leave you with. Not that things work out, because they don't always, but that showing up honestly, every day, without certainty, that's the whole thing. That's all of it.